Irene. Today I wanted to come and talk to you about white genocide. It's also being called the Great Replacement, nationalism, ethnomasochism, which is essentially hating yourself and so feeling like you deserve to be replaced. And these are all kind of headlines and or reasons that people think there's a problem with white reproduction, or whites are being replaced, or whites are under attack, or whatever the feeling is of the groups of people that believe in this. And I really want to I'm big on accountability. So even within my own community, there are things that plague my community, and I don't make excuses for those things. I don't make excuses for Black on Black crime. I don't make excuses for fatherlessness in the home. I always count for, I always move toward accountability, because I think that's the first step in actually improving things. And in the same way, as I go through what people that are parts of these groups or believe in these things feel is the issue, I'm going to also point to the actual issues and accountability, because what I hear is very little accountability, but a lot of whining, complaining, finger pointing, and calls for, throwing money at the problem as if that's going to help a lot of these issues, when a lot of the reasons there's a decline in the white population have to do with personal accountability of individual whites. And we'll talk about that as we go. The first thing I want to touch on is immigration. It's a really hot button topic throughout white countries all over the world, including countries like Germany, who have sort of an open door policy to immigration. Here in the United States, we bring in, I said in another one of my videos, almost 1 million immigrants a year. Now, everybody who watches my videos knows that I'm for merit-based immigration. So I don't like to just bring in a bunch of people who are useless and are going to sit around on welfare. I don't even feel immigrants should really be able to get welfare, at most for 6 months after they've been here, a couple years at minimum, but preferably never at all, because obviously we're not bringing people in this country just to suck out money from American citizens and taxpayers in our country. That said, without immigration, specifically, let's just talk about the United States now. Without immigration in the United States, our population would decrease. We are not at replacement rate as a country. And so those bodies really help to stabilize and grow our population. And so the take from these groups, the nationalists, people who believe in the Great Replacement, people who believe in white genocide, is just to bring in more white bodies. So we have a problem with whites reproducing and growing in our country, then just if we bring in more white bodies, that will solve the problem. Here's the thing, the low reproduction rate of whites is universal throughout the planet. All white societies, places that are predominantly white, have low birth weights. In some cases, it's alarmingly low, where they have huge campaigns to try to get people just to even have sex more, so they have a better chance at getting pregnant. And this is really interesting. This is kind of where, the hammer hits the nail, so to speak, because every other population in the world, for the most part, except for some Asian populations, is having no problem with fertility, really. However, those populations who carry that up to 4% Neanderthal DNA are having population reproductive issues. And this is only interesting from a scientific standpoint. Again, no shade, just talking the science, because that presence of Neanderthal DNA automatically makes your groups more susceptible to infertility. You're naturally infertile because of that. This is also something that makes you guys sort of naturally unique. Although everybody knows that from a scientific standpoint, we literally are just one race. There aren't multiple races. I have a whole video on that from a scientific standpoint with the data and the links. So this is not an arguable point. But in that data, it does say that a very minute portion, like 1% of DNA, can vary because of environmental factors. And so when we look at that, sort of Eurasian DNA pool, they have that up to 4% Neanderthal DNA, and those populations are historically less fertile. So rather than kind of whining over immigration, because again, bringing in more white bodies that are infertile is not going to help fertility. because they're having the same problems in their own country. So the logic in that is a little flawed. What would make sense is research looking into how to correct the problem, looking into why exactly it is that white populations are not able to reproduce at the rate of everybody else in the world. And I think that would be a more productive avenue to take than simply finger pointing at immigrants or policies, or thinking that you can bring in more bodies that have the same problem you do and somehow improve the issue, when whole countries full of those white bodies are having serious fertility problems. So that's just some food for thought. Another thing is that white men have a high suicide rate. White women also have the highest suicide rates. Let's talk about white women first, because we can blow through it much more quickly than we can white men. White women have the highest suicide rates. White women also have the highest drug rates, okay? So people are killing themselves, and that is causing population decline that we're seeing. Also, they have the highest drug overdose rates. You know, this goes again to personal accountability. If people aren't using drugs, they can overdose and die, okay? If people are killing themselves, it's going to bring your population down. And white women and white men are both killing themselves. They both have alarmingly high drug overdose rates within the country. In fact, stats show that most drugs and narcotics are consumed by white America. So, you know, this is one of those things where it's no conspiracy against you. It's more accountability, individual accountability, making the choice not to do drugs, making the choice to not do drugs. As far as white suicide, we'll get a little bit into the reasons people say for white suicide, which are pretty fascinating. That whites are committing suicide, they're pretty fascinating, but let's just keep moving on. Now, I want to say just really quickly, white women are committing suicide at the highest rate, but they also live longer than almost every other woman other than Hispanic women, Hispanic whites, right? And that is 81.1 years. So they are living long lives when they do live, but they do have the highest suicide rate amongst women. White men, their suicide rate is at 26.5 per 100,000 people. This is almost triple what it is for, and that's Hispanic non-white populations, for Hispanic whites and for Black people. So their suicide rate is almost triple what it is for Hispanic whites and Black people. Again, that is reaching into the population decline. So this is not, right now, we're talking about things you guys have control over. You can't help your fertility, right? We really need the science to look into that. But things you guys can definitely help with, using drugs so you don't overdose, you know? Something else you can definitely help with is addressing the suicide problem within your community that's often tied to drug and alcohol abuse, which strangely, one of the other major factors in your population decline is liver disease from alcohol consumption. So there are some substance abuse issues going on within the white community. Again, this is not a conspiracy against white people. This is individual whites that need to be more accountable for their actions. So if you're not drinking to the point that you rot your liver out, if you're not doing drugs to the point that you are overdosing, if the suicide, you know, the mental health, because some of the reasons that they cited for suicide was mental illness as number one. If we address the mental health issues in the white community, then those are areas that can easily be tackled. But again, these are not external forces making anybody do anything. I know a lot of people will say, well, the doctors are prescribing, you know, a lot of these medications and things like that. Here's the thing. Again, it comes down to self-accountability. It really does. I have been prescribed opioids myself when I go to the hospital. I make the choice as an individual to not take them. That's my personal choice. If somebody else chooses otherwise, if they become hooked on a drug, get them some help. But my point is, it's personal accountability. Do you know what I mean? This is not a finger pointing situation. Same thing with alcohol abuse. You know, we make choices, and those choices have consequences. When those choices are widespread throughout a community, they often have consequences that are measurable. And right now we're seeing those measurable consequences are the decline in the white population. Now let's talk about situational. Okay, so one of the reasons that there's a claim that whites are committing suicide at such a high rate is situational, because the working class jobs are really kind of dried up. Hence the push for better work and more work in America. And also that when you don't have a when you're not college educated, you have no degree, you're more likely to be suicidal. So poor whites are greatly affected by this. Interestingly enough, other populations, such as Black and non-white Hispanic and white Hispanic populations, are affected by these same factors, but their mortality rates are actually going up. So these studies are studying all the groups of people at one time, and what they're finding, whites are the only people that are suffering these situations. This is really fascinating to me, and here's what the scientists are saying. They're saying because whites have the expectation that they should do better generationally, and Blacks and Hispanic whites and Hispanic non-whites don't have an expectation that they should be able to do better because historically they never have. Whites are greatly affected by not doing better. I found this to be really fascinating because whenever people talk about white privilege, most white people are like, what do you mean I don't have privilege? And yet the studies are saying that the reason these disparities as far as income, not being able to find a job, not being able to have a college education, are literally affecting whites so much more, to the point that they're killing themselves, whereas fertility rates and reproduction rates and overall population rates are going up for every other community, is because they do recognize that they should be privileged and that they are greater affected when they don't reap the benefits of that privilege. I actually found that extremely, extremely fascinating. There was so much information that I could literally make a whole separate video on this with lectures and data, and I'm actually going to do that when I have more time. I just had such a fire in my belly over the data that I wanted to share this with you now, but be looking out for, one where I'm not showing myself, where I'm just going to be throwing up the data and the information. Really fascinating stuff. Really something to think about. Also, feminism and lack of just general moral standards is affecting fertility. So feminism has women being very rebellious. They're not wanting to reproduce even. So this is, and I say this about my community as well, a matter of getting control over your women. They're kind of running amok. And the same thing with Black women. Black women are running amok. I think this just is a lot, a fail for male leadership. When you have, and the same thing with women being the highest drug users and overdosing, and that affecting the white population. Men, you've got to get control over your women. And I just say that for men of all skin colors, not just white men. You must get control over your women. Your women are running amok out here in these streets. And with proper male leadership, you could really jump on those situations where these women are refusing to get married, refusing to reproduce, strung out on drugs, binge drinking, thinking that's cute. Just these are issues that have to be addressed. Again, individual accountability. Also, the desire to cohabitate rather than marry is affecting the population. These are all things that studies are showing are affecting the population. Right now, white women are only reproducing at 1.8 children per woman. It's really, and you need at least two children to reproduce. We live in a society that really frowns upon women having children. Like I said, I have a great deal of children now. I'm not a poor person by any stretch of the imagination, but with that said, people give me like the crazy eye when I come. Are they all yours? Or not anymore, because I have adult children. I have children in their 20s, but I have some little ones too. But When I had more that were all in the house, you know, people would give me the crazy eye. The thing is, my people aren't even at replacement rates. So women like me are actually making it better for the climate of children, you know, and also in a marriage, you have children, you know, every couple of years or so. I know families with 15 kids. I know families with 7 or 8 kids. Sometimes biological, sometimes adopted, sometimes a mix of both. So there are large families here in these states, but the thing is, with feminism and with such a negative attitude towards people who choose to reproduce, it really affects people's desire to reproduce. And that's what we're seeing, is a lack of desire to reproduce. And then when they do reproduce, a lack of desire of having more than 1 or 2 children. And 2 children is the bare minimal you need to replace your kind. The bare minimum that you need. Now, believe it or not, I spend a lot of time talking to racists. Strangely, racists really vary from not wanting to talk to anybody that doesn't look like them, to being able to hold a conversation with people that look like them, but then they're always taking like cheap shots. So, you know, because their populations are infertile, they'll say we're reproducing like rabbits. And I'm like, that just sounds like hate, you know, not like racial hate, but just like you're hating on the fact that other people can reproduce and you can't. But what I find when I talk to them is I try to provide them. I'm like, look, if you really hate everybody that looks like you and you really feel that there is a problem that's being caused by external forces because they think interracial dating is part of the problem, you know, where very few people actually mix. Like, I swirled, you know, I have swirly children, but everybody didn't make that choice. Most people don't make that choice. So interracial dating is not taking a toll on your population to the extent that liver disease, low reproductive rates, drug abuse, suicide, do you know what I mean? All of those factors are taking a toll on your race. And again, I'm using race because that's the common vernacular of the time, not because of any personal investment in the word. But some things that I suggest is, and this is going to sound very radical because when I say this, they feel like I'm telling them, like, you go back to Africa. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you go to predominantly white countries that are historically white, because you hear them often complain about how historically white countries are being taken over by non-whites. If you go to those countries and actively try to reproduce and resecure your borders and take back those areas that are historically yours, you stand a better chance than being spread wide and thin. Again, another solution is to really looking into why it is that your fertility rates are low. I don't know if you guys can hear the cicadas. Those things are so creepy to me. We don't have them in California. Not that I know of. They're insane, but they're very loud. They keep, you know, they get all riled up and then they come back in. But again, addressing the fertility issue. I think these are real things, you know, addressing the fertility issue, putting money behind the research to find out why it is your people are incapable of reproducing at the rates of other people from a biological standpoint, so that can be addressed. Okay. I think that's really important, because that's a real question to ask. Like, you guys have all the same bits and pieces as we all do. We all share the same genetic material. So what is it about you in particular? And this is something in the Asian population that's happening as well. Japan is having a huge problem with this. Believe it or not, in the Asias, all over Europe and Asia, all over Eurasia, we're seeing this decline in population. There is something genetically, biologically going on there. And that should be researched. That would be productive, not hating other people, okay? Again, lessening, you know, calling for accountability. I think right now this attitude of babying people on drugs and blaming the doctors and like, no. Okay, first of all, if the doctors stop writing the prescriptions, if the person's strung out, they're just going to turn to street drugs. We can't baby people who lack self-control. You know, I always say, you know, because I didn't grow up in a poor Black community, I always say, you know, for those of us that are more educated in my community, for those of us who were fortunate enough to have a better upbringing, we really have to reach to the poor communities and support them and hold them accountable and know when to distance or draw in individuals so that we can better our community. And the white community is no different. It's not going to pay to baby these people. It's not going to pay to baby the people that are drug addicts and to make this like, oh, woe is them, they're victims. You know what I mean? This is no. There's accountability there. And the thing is, we live in a society where we don't want to hold people accountable. The same thing with alcohol abuse. You know, this idea of, you know, the white college student that's just binge drinking and having fun in college, that's all well and good until somebody develops alcohol dependency and then they're dying early and your population is decreasing. So we need to make it not as socially acceptable anymore in your community. And so I think there's a lot of just general accountability issues that everybody wants to gloss over. And then also being introspective. You know, like I said, poor whites are facing the same situations as everybody else, but they are breaking under that pressure. You know, mental illness is a real thing in the white community and it needs to be addressed. You know, these little boys are running out and just killing people. They're getting strung out on drugs, self-medicating. They're killing themselves because they feel their situation is desperate. But people in those same situations who are not white aren't doing that. And so addressing those mental health concerns, that's something. Access to mental health and things like that. And see, this is where some really right-leaning people, you know, this is the problem where you really have to look at. The left has a lot of stuff. I'm not a lefty, okay? But the left, as you guys like to call them, have a lot of ideas that are good. And some of those ideas would support access to medical. And in your community, because let's just be real, in rural areas, and this is why, you know, when I did that video on whites receive the most welfare, people were all up in arms per capita and in raw stats. People were all up in arms. But what you guys... You tend to ignore a whole population of people, and these are a lot of the people that voted for Trump. These are whites in rural areas, and they're dirt poor. There aren't businesses there. There's not access to mental health facilities there. And so a lot of these leftist policies would provide for these individuals. These are the people that are strung out on drugs. You know, and so you're ignoring a whole section of your community and then saying it's interracial people, it's bringing in all these immigrants that aren't white. It's, you know, it's everything but accountability. Again, if people are still going to be binge drinking, getting liver disease and dying, if people are still going to be strung out on drugs and overdosing, if people are still going to be committing suicide at 3 times the rate, if people are still not going to have proper access and mental health treatment, you know, if people are still not going to be addressing the real issues within your community, looking into why fertility is low worldwide in the white community, moving white bodies into this country isn't going to be enough because they're having the same problems in their own countries. So it is cultural. And you guys have to get a hold of that. You got to get behind that. Now, I say that I feel every culture is valuable, and I truly do. I always say I identify as Christian first, and then I identify with people who phenotypically look like me. You know, and that is okay. That is okay. You know, I want to address one more thing. Thinking that bringing in white bodies will preserve a culture because whites just have a general, you know, kind of big soup of a culture throughout the world. That's not true. White culture is very varied. Okay, white people aren't uniform from one country to the next. In fact, a lot of the liberal behavior that a lot of the conservative people don't like, such as homosexuality, transgenderism, things like that, are very prominent in some almost totally white societies. They're really on board with this because that's their particular culture. Okay? I've said before, in Europe, sex with children is normalized to the point where they're the highest sexual child abuse capital of the world. It's a different culture than we have here in the United States. We go hard for that. We go hard for protection of children. So, you know, this idea that just because you look like a person, they're going to be exactly like you is very stupid. As somebody who's Geechee, my culture is different from somebody in Chicago. You know, French Creole's culture are different. You know, from, you know what I'm saying? Like, so this idea, just even within the United States, we have different cultures. White people in California are complete, and I just want to say, big up to the white people in California. You guys are reproducing, okay? But white people in California are nothing like white people in the Midwest. Trust me, I know. Okay, when I left California, it was the first time anybody ever called me anything other than my name. Okay, so this idea that simply because a person looks like you, you're going to be able to maintain American culture. What it protects American culture are Americans. Us people who can trace our ancestry back in America to almost the beginning of America. That protects American culture. Not somebody that phenotypically looks like us. As a Black American, I am more similar to you, white American, in my culture than somebody from overseas. Okay? Think about, in England, there's a monarchy. I mean, you gotta really think about what you're saying, you know? So I think what we really have to get behind is just accountability. There are real problems within the white community. And if you just focus all your energy on hating people because they don't look like you, what you aren't going to do is you're not going to address the problems in your community. And to prove this, I will say that even before the opioid epidemic, your community was at a decline. Since the 90s, your community has been at a decline. And as your vigil for other people gets stronger and stronger, those issues within your community are becoming greater and greater, where the disparity is huge now. And so your approach may be wrong. Okay, your approach may need to get a little bit more introspective. I'm not going to do what some people say and dismiss you and say there's not a problem. What I will say is that maybe you should focus on the problem. Focus on feminism. Focus on reproduction. Focus on reinstilling the desire to be married versus cohabitate. You know, because your marriage levels are going down, even though you do still have the highest level of marriage in the United States, it's still on a decline. Focus on drug abuse, mental health. Focus on getting funding for science to look into why it is worldwide your population is infertile. Focus on those things. And don't hate groups of people who don't have those same issues. That's not a conspiracy. As you focus on the conspiracy, you know what you fail to do? You fail to address the real issues in your community. Those are my 2 cents. You know, like them or don't like them. And I will talk to you guys later.